Yes. So my name is Paul Ellis. Welcome. Pleased to have you all here. On behalf of the New York Technology Council, we're pleased to have you for tonight's session, Legal Essentials for Startups, Financing Strategies. So for those of you who are not familiar with the New York Technology Council, we are a nonprofit industry association. Here is a list of our annual sponsors, a large and ever-growing list of organizations that are supporting NYTECH in our various activities. We actually go to 2 slides these days, which seems like a sign of progress. Special thanks this evening to EisnerAmper, our host in this great space. EisnerAmper is an accounting firm that does a lot of work in the tech community in New York City, has a lot of expertise, so we're really pleased to have them supporting the NYTECH mission and providing us with their space this evening. So the legal track, for those of you who are regulars, and I see a number of you in the audience, you know that we present various issues of interest to CEOs, principals, in-house counsel of technology companies, both small, mid-size, and even larger companies. We've had issues on patent protection. We have the startup series. We've had issues on sections on advertising and social media, various topics that address the legal issues of concern to the tech community. We're all corporate lawyers and all have a lot of experience working with these types of startup technology companies. I will be walking through the PowerPoint slides in the first instance, and then I will turn it over to my able colleagues to add their comments and war stories and answer questions and whatever else. So again, my name is Paul Ellis. My firm is Paul Ellis Law Group. We are a 6-lawyer boutique in Midtown Manhattan. We do a lot of work with small to mid-sized technology companies in areas including formation, financing, intellectual property protection, employee equity plans, general operations, and mergers and acquisitions, that is buying and selling companies. We also work with individual and institutional investors. We are all senior lawyers, and we've all been trained in large firms, so we're able to offer the expertise of a large firm with small firm flexible pricing and personalized attention. Also, because of the amount of work we do in the technology community, we can often make introductions for our clients to other service providers, investors, and the like. So joining me here this evening, we also have Kevin Saer, a partner with Davis, Wright, Tremaine, and Jerry Siegel, a partner with Frankfurt, Kurnit. So guys, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. I don't know
if should be on.
Thank you all for coming. I don't know.
That's fine.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Kevin Saer. I'm a partner at the law firm of Davis, Wright, Tremaine. We have offices here in New York and offices on the West Coast and other offices in the city. I'm one of the principal lawyers in our corporate group, and we do a lot of work with respect to early stage companies, specifically a lot of technology companies and digital media companies, and that involves early stage financing, later stage financing, and M&A work. So we really have a full service practice that really caters to the digital and early stage community in New York.
My name is Jerry Siegel. I'm a partner at the law firm of Frankfurt, Kurnit, Klein, and Selz. And Frankfurt, Kurnit specializes in media, entertainment, and technology. I started the technology practice there many years ago, and we do all the same things that my 2 colleagues do here for our technology firms. Plus, we do a lot of work in the media and entertainment space, so we also do a lot of early stage work in those areas as well.
All right, so we have a lot of material to cover today. We're going to try to move quickly, but we'll certainly be happy to take, I see the food has arrived. All right, that's good. So once that's set up, people should feel free to go back and imbibe. I won't be offended if you can't get up and walk out during the presentation. So we have a lot of material to cover today. It's a broad topic. we're happy to do some Q&A as we go, but don't be surprised if I cut things off from time to time in order to keep moving and get to the end of the presentation. One thing that I will say, my secretary was finalizing this today and was asking me, well, what does this term mean and what does that term mean? And it brought home how much jargon there is in our space, in what we do. And sometimes I may not even realize the jargon. So feel free, if there's a term that I use that someone doesn't know, this is the time to ask it. That's why we're all here. So feel free to raise your hand and shout out, to slow down or explain or whatever else I need to do. Anyway, what are we going to do today? We are going to take you from the initial stages of thinking about your financing through to how you identify potential investors and then how you can structure your financing. I can't tell you that we will be able to give you all the answers today, but we'll certainly make you more aware of the issues and help to position you a little bit better when that comes time for your company. We will finish with a few words about securities laws so you can stay out of trouble. So we're going to talk about the financing strategy. Then we'll talk about bootstrapping and other strategies that you should think about employing before you get to outside funding, whether it's postponing or avoiding altogether, strategies that you should keep in mind. We're going to talk about VC financing and angel financing, the various, how VCs differ from angels, the costs and benefits of the different approaches. We're going to talk about what VCs are looking for when they evaluate a company and investment opportunity. We'll talk about how much to raise, and the process. We'll talk about valuation, what VCs in particular think about when they're looking at a company and how they think about valuation. Then we will go into the structuring of investment round. We'll talk about the different instruments, common stock, convertible notes and safes, and then convertible preferred stock. And finally, we'll talk about securities laws. So there's a lot there, but let's jump right in. Okay. What I say, often when my clients come in and they talk about raising money, they have a way of jumping right to okay, we need to raise $500,000. How do we do it? How do we structure it? And what I'll often say to them is, okay, we can talk about that, but think a little bit about what your strategy is. What's the long-term goal? Where do you expect to be? Where's the company going? So you make right choices along the way. For one thing to think about is, what are your objectives? Are you looking for a company that you're going to grow quickly and then hopefully flip to a larger buyer? Or is this a company you're expecting to run for a long time and to keep throwing off cash? So I just got the signal that the food and drink is ready to go. So don't all rush at once, but feel free to get up and grab something during the presentation. So anyway, objectives. Then think about the timing considerations. What is your competitive environment like? Are you in a situation where there are several other competitors that are all going after the same market or the same space? That may force the issue, so you need to move quickly and get financing. Similar, do you have first mover advantage that you need to maintain? And the way to maintain that may be to go out and get financing to stay ahead of the pack. Think about your own objectives and your own approach. Are you prepared for a slow ramp up that may take some time and will keep you relatively poor as a founder along the way? And then again, the nature of the business. Some businesses, I have clients that have businesses that are basically throwing off cash from day one. They're in a very different position from the companies that are going to have a long development cycle before they're really starting to generate new revenue. Think about the amount of funding you need to achieve your objectives. How much and how soon? Some industries, like the tech industry, IT, e-commerce, it's relatively inexpensive to start a company in this space. Other areas like pharma and life sciences, it's almost impossible not to start a company without bringing in significant money. Think about your tolerance and your need for guidance and control, because if you bring in VC investors, they are going to have a seat at the table, literally. They will be on the board, they will be at all the important meetings, and they're going to want to know what you're doing, and they will have an opinion about many things which you may or may not agree with. So that's something you should think about when you're talking about financing. Do you need contacts into the industry? That's one of the things that a VC will offer beyond money. And finally, is your company or you interested in pursuing objectives simply beyond making money? If you have an interest in pure science or social objectives, which are laudable goals, you need to think hard before you bring in VC money, because VCs by and large are going to be interested in how soon you're going to get to an exit and how much money you'll make for them. And they may be less interested in your other objectives.
One of the things I just wanted to add, that comes up a lot, as Paul was saying, like, people will come to you and say, we want to raise some money, we don't really know how much. And one of the key things I think there is, and a lot of founders or early stage entrepreneurs might lose sight of this, you really need to be able to quantify where that money will get you, because just merely raising a couple $1 million to put a few foosball tables and keep your employees paid is not really what a VC is interested in. They want to see that $1.5 million or $3 million that you're trying to raise is really going to get you to the next critical milestone. So when you're thinking about how much money should we be going out into the market and raising, apart from issues of dilution and how much control do you give up in your company and what is it going to cost you to raise that money, you really need to be able to say, if we raise $1 million or $2 million, it will get us to this step. Or we have a firm belief that it will get us to this step. And then once we're at that step, we feel we've increased the value of our company by X or whatever it might be. So you really need to peg those dollars to some kind of achievable milestone that you can realize with those monies.
Yeah, and it needs to be in writing. I mean, you really need to be able to show where the money's going and then where you think it's going to come back to you. So those projections are really important.
Okay, so let's talk about before we get to outside financing, what are some of the alternatives to think about? Some of these are pretty self-evident, and some of them you may not have thought about as much. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but I'm going to touch on them. Obviously, sweat equity. You're all out there, working on your companies, making little or nothing at it. And that really, it's an element of compensation alternatives. Deferred salaries, reduced salaries. Equity grants, obviously that's how the tech industry runs. People get paid less, but they get equity with the hopes of a big exit. Your other sources of cash, your savings, home equity lines, credit cards. Think about hybrid business models and consulting services. I have several clients that they have a product or a system that they're building, but they also do consulting, and the consulting work helps to drive them in the direction of their ultimate objective. So that the consulting projects often help them with the development that they need for their ultimate goal. But in addition, just having a day job is a good way to finance your company. Creative equipment procurement, obviously, there's so many ways these days using the cloud to take advantage of low-cost services and equipment. Facility solutions, we all know all sorts of incubators and shared workspaces. Management of working capital. The large companies do it. There's no reason you shouldn't do it either. To the extent you're actually generating revenue, think about what your cycle is in terms of payables and receivables. And if you manage that process well by getting receivables in quickly and stretching out payables a little bit, that can often help you with your financing a little bit. And as I said, the large companies are doing it, so there's no reason you shouldn't do it. There are lots of government tax incentives out there. It is important to take advantage of them. R&D credits. I mean, if you're working with a good accounting firm like EisnerAmper, they've got people that know all of those types of tax incentives that are out there and help you to maximize them. It's important to work with an accountant that knows that space, because that can put hundreds of thousands of dollars in your pocket if you're actually making revenues. Customer advances and prepayments for larger projects. If you have a solution that's really important to a customer, they may be willing to make prepayments if they know that that's part of how you're going to achieve the objective. of building their system. Government grants, reduced fees in exchange for exploiting the software. Again, this goes back to the hybrid business model. Sometimes what you're building for a customer is something that you need, has larger applications. And may be willing to take a smaller fee for that work if you have the right to repurpose that software or that technology for something else. And then non-equity crowdfunding, like Kickstarter, the best known example, can obviously be a good way to fund your company.
The one thing I'll just add, one of the things Paul mentioned early on about a lot of founders, financing a business with credit card or home equity loan. The one thing there, though, I think to be mindful of is that generally when you do later stage funding, you get some angel funding or VC funding, the money that you generally put in the early stages, it's probably not going to get repaid, even though you might be putting it on your credit card or thinking of it as a loan to the company. By and large, professional investors, when they invest money in your company, they don't want that money utilized to pay back loans or deferred salary to you. They're going to really view that for the most part as capital that you contributed to the business, and you're probably going to be hard pressed to take that money out when you ultimately get some funding. So I know a lot of people come to us and say, I lent all this money, all this company, several $100,000. I've rarely seen situations where VCs and professional investors have really let a lot of that money go out to the founders after they put it in. So you may have no alternative. That's really the way you have to do it. You have a belief in your business, and you're going to put everything you have into it. But I wouldn't have too much of an expectation, those sort of early stage founder loans, if you're ever getting them repaid for the most part.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Don't put that money in if you're expecting to get it back from the investors.
It's like loaning money to a relative. It's there, but you don't really expect to get paid back.
All right, so that was sort of the bootstrapping side. Then think about alternative sources of financing beyond going to angels or VCs. Friends and family is the obvious approach. Now, we're not going to talk about friends and family financing separately, although I would say that a lot of the principles that we talk about with respect to angel financing are really equally applicable to friends and family financing. We generally use the same type of structures. Often it's a convertible note. Supplier and vendor financing, depending on your business and how it's set up and what your needs are. If you have vendors out there that would like to become a preferred provider going forward, they may be able or willing to invest in your success. Strategic partnerships and alliances. We don't talk about strategic investors too much today, but obviously that can be an important part of how early stage companies find money. Just think long and hard about what strings get attached to that money and what they may be looking for from the relationship. Small business loans and microfinancing. And finally, equity crowdfunding, which is obviously a very hot topic these days. I will tell you, we are not going to be talking about equity crowdfunding too much today. It's really such a large and important topic. We're going to have an entire separate session dedicated to equity crowdfunding in September or October. So if you get on our mailing list, you will be invited to that event and get the latest on that. So what are the costs of alternative strategies? We know what the benefits are. You may delay or avoid altogether having to give away equity in your company. But the costs, slower growth may mean that you miss a market opportunity. As I noted, certain types of companies simply require significant investment if you're ever going to get anywhere. If you're running low on cash, it's going to mean you're always living hand to mouth instead of really focusing on blowing out the company. And ultimately it can result in failure. And failure means that you didn't achieve your objective, but it also means that because you assumed 100% of the risk, you're also assuming 100% of the losses. And that goes back to Kevin's point. Yes, all right. Yep.
Can you give an example of strategic partnerships and what advantages would that bring?
Well, a strategic partnership, an example of one? The question is examples of strategic partnerships and what benefits that can bring. Well, so for example, Microsoft is very interested in investing in companies that are building on the Microsoft platform. or you know, I mean, any larger company that sees, you know, maybe I had a client recently sold to Apple, a mapping service, and you know that, you know, when you know, maybe Apple has an interest in a product or technology that they would like to be able to incorporate into their platform at some point. So they might want to make an investment early on in that company. Now, that's the sort of situation where you need to be careful, because they clearly have their eye on you for the future. And so while you may like their money because it helps, and their validation of what you're doing, because you need the money, you need to think about what strings are attached. There may be provisions written into their contracts that, you know, I mean, to use an extreme example, they have a right of first refusal if you want to sell the company, or you know, they have a right to take 100% of the next round of investment, or you know, maybe preferred pricing, or customer relationships, or there are any number of things that can go into a strategic partner arrangement that will come with a strategic investment that could cause you problems down the line. And even if there's nothing contractually that is a problem, just the fact that Apple is a major investor in your company is going to be a signal to the industry that, oh, Apple has their eyes on this one, or this is Apple's company, or they, you know, and that when you're looking for an exit, that will chill your exit opportunities to the point that that may be your only potential buyer, which may not be the situation you want to be in.
And I think for the most part, you'll see fewer, like pure strategic plays in really early stage companies. You tend to see them in a little bit more developed companies. We have a lot of clients in the financial services industry, a lot of, like, let's say, fintech companies get a lot of action from some of the banks and financial institutions, because everyone's kind of unsure of what the next big thing is going to be in terms of mobile payments or other technologies like that. So they'll want to kind of get in on the ground floor of some of these fintech companies, so they don't want to be sort of left out in the cold that becomes the next big thing. But I think for real early stage financing, you tend to see it a little less often, because the companies are less proven. You know, once you have a technology that's really demonstrated, or a product or service that's demonstrated, I think you'll probably see a little bit more interest from a strategic partner as opposed to a, you know, sort of a pure financial investor.
It can also depend really on the industry, and we do a lot of work in the advertising and marketing services industry, and any of you who are familiar with that industry know that it's a highly competitive, and there are actually groups of agencies that exist. They're all owned by parent companies, and if you are providing services to the industry and you are you get an invitation for an investment from one of those companies, or an opportunity to sell to one of those companies, what you may discover is you'll lose a lot of your business. And that's actually happened to us in a number of instances. So we actually counsel clients in that industry when they're looking at those types of transactions to make sure that it's not going to adversely impact their business.
All right, so let's talk about the players. You know, again, we're not talking too much about friends and family, although that is an important source of early stage financing. And I think it's probably worth noting that to some extent friends and family, friends and family often shades over into angel investors. You know, depending on who your friends are, you know, they may end up being like angel investors in a sense anyway. So what do we mean when we talk about angel investors? It's actually a term that is pretty broad. So unlike VCs, where, you know, VCs are pretty, there's a lot of uniformity or regularity among the VC industry, angels, we're talking about a broad group of people. We're talking about investors who are more sophisticated, who have a lot of experience in their space and know exactly what they're doing and can give you a lot of guidance. But it can also be people that are just, you know, have some excess cash and they're looking to make a few extra bucks, and they may not really know much about your industry, but they think they see a good opportunity, they want to put some money into it. And so there's a broad spectrum in terms of what what constitutes an angel investor. You do see a lot of high net worth individuals, family offices. As I noted, they're not as cohesive as VCs. You see individual angels who are just looking for good opportunities. You see syndicates. You see very tightly run organizations like New York Angels. There's a broad spectrum of people that fall within the definition of angels. Generally, angels are going to make smaller investments than VCs. Again, it's not a rule, but you'll certainly see angels in the six-figure numbers. You'll see them, even into the low millions. The higher angels will make higher investments, especially when you're looking at family offices. But that's when they tend to flame out. After that, you really need to look at VCs. VCs, on the other hand, are generally looking at larger investments, but you certainly have VCs these days that are doing smaller rounds as well. They may or may not have industry expertise, as I noted, and there can be all sorts of motivations for angels. There are people that are looking to turn a quick buck. There are those who may not need the money, but they love the space and they just want to be active in it. And frankly, there are people out there that they don't actually do much investing. They just do a lot of shopping. And so those are people you need to be aware of, because angels can waste your time in that respect. So what are their strengths? They can offer significant funding. The terms can be reasonable. They will come in generally earlier than VCs. And if they know what they're doing, if they know their industry, they can provide guidance and context. And because we'll talk a little bit about the timing of VCs. VCs are on usually a tight time frame in terms of when they need to get to liquidity. Angels do not have to have that same kind of timing pressure, so often they will be less concerned about the time to an exit. The limitations of angels, they are not generally a source of further funding. They can be, but you shouldn't count on it. If they're less sophisticated, they will ask for terms that may simply be unacceptable. And if you give them unreasonable terms, that can create problems when you go for your next round of financing. Because they are not, compelled by virtue of their fund to deploy their funds over a certain time horizon, they can be much more loose about the process. They don't need to invest. They're only doing it for fun often. And so you need to be careful because angels can waste your time in that sense. And then once they're on board, the investor relations can be very time consuming. VCs generally have to be more disciplined in how they use their time. Angels can suck a lot of your time as a founder.
Yeah, one thing I would add to what Paul was saying, the idea that if you're doing angel financing and there is varying levels of sophistication, some people are serial entrepreneurs, they're serial angels, they're sort of professional investors, others just dabble in it. And when you get one, try to keep the terms fairly consistent to what's market, because I've seen this happen a lot. In order to get that first $300,000 or $500,000 to sort of get some seed money into the company, companies will tend to agree to really sort of way out of market term, giving angels multiple seats on the board and all kinds of preferential rights. And generally, you can clean that up in the next round, but generally the way the financings work is the next guy in always gets a little bit more. So when you start with this really high bar in terms of what your investors get and they haven't put in a lot of money, you've created this expectation, so everyone who layers on top is going to get a little bit more than that. And you'd be surprised at how quickly you can find yourself pretty crammed down as a founder. So really, I'd say if you're dealing with the angels, try to keep the terms of an angel investment consistent with something that you might see in an angel round as opposed to something that somebody might get in a Series B round or a much later stage financing. And it's expensive to put it in place too, when they start getting all those kind of rights.
How often do you see VCs buying out the angel round entirely?
Buying out the investors, you mean?
Yeah, I don't see that
Not very often.
Yeah.
One thing, I'd give another twist on what Kevin just said. He was talking about terms getting too rich as you go forward. The thing that I see that I think is problematic is the terms that are unusual or odd. An angel that will want non-diluting equity, or That's probably the best example. Something really off the wall, and then the VC will come in and they'll look at the rights that the angel will have, and if they really like the opportunity, maybe they'll say, okay, we'll try to clean this one up. But what you need to be concerned about is they'll take a look at it and they'll say, oh, life is too short, and your plan will go in the trash, and they'll move on to the next 10 pitch decks that they have on their desk.
And sometimes you can use that as bargaining with respect to your angels to say, listen, I don't necessarily have a big problem giving these rights, but we're not. This is not the end all. This little investment that you're making, this $500,000 or whatever amount you're raising, that's just one stage in hopefully a lot of further investment. So they have to be on board with kind of keeping the terms of their investment consistent with what the market is out there, because like Paul was saying, it's going to just chill investment in your company for the future.
It's hard to do, but sometimes you really do have to say no. And I can just give you one little war story of a client I had a number of years ago who accepted a single large investment from an angel investor who had been the CEO of a large magazine publisher. And he decided midway through the launch of this company, which was building social media for museums, that the best use of that software was for the sale of magazine subscriptions. And there was needless to say, a rather intense disagreement over that. And he basically told the founders that if they didn't like it, he would shut the company down, and that's what he did. So it can happen. Sometimes you're better off not taking it.
So how do you find out what's consistent or reasonable?
Well, you come to sessions like this. You work with a lawyer who knows. I mean, we all do this, many times a month or a year or whatever. So, we can tell you this is reasonable. It's not reasonable. I also represent angels who don't really have a good sense about what they're doing, and sometimes I'll hold them back. I'll say, no, don't ask for that. It's going to set you up and set the company up for failure. So a lawyer who knows what they're doing will, I don't know what.
Yeah, and there are resources if you go on the web. You can probably find typical. Even if you were doing a little bit of larger round and it would kind of get into something that would be what I might call a seed round, maybe $1 million, $1.5 million at a maximum. I think that there is like a consistent set of terms that would be developed around something like that. It would look a certain way. I mean, there may be several variations in terms of rights that these folks might get, but generally, I think if you sort of talk to someone who did a lot of those, you come up with a pretty standard set of rights that an investor would have at that particular level.
How do you handle valuation perception? So if you have another valuation, another financing angel round going on, and there's a discrepancy about what the expectation is between the prior angel, they want to have a certain valuation that they expect versus the new angel coming in, and he's a very high-profile person who can also give strategic operational advice and will dedicate time to it. How could you handle that? Because you do want to show between every financing round basically a good increase of valuation. Are there some ways to kind of manage that?
Well, I guess there are a couple of issues there, and you guys can feel free to jump in. Generally, the valuation should reflect not so much the desires of the investor, but actually what the company is in fact worth. And we're going to talk more about valuation going forward, but value is really a function of the perceptions of the opportunity and the amount of risks. So as a company grows and as the risks get diminished, then the value of the company should increase. If you're saying you have an angel investor, a subsequent investor that wants to see that
we're just right now discussing because we have a couple of percent off, and now if you're going towards this rate, then the prior investor doesn't really see a big hike in it, but the new investor is also really putting time in. So is there a way to handle it with option grant that you say, okay, we're going to settle the investment on X, and the discrepancy we may make up with an option grant because you're putting this expertise and time and hours into it, or how would you do it so that the valuation at the end is still gonna be perceived?
Well, if the one that's coming in is, in addition to providing money, also providing services in some way, consulting services, or if they're on your advisory board or something, maybe there's a way to compensate them, separately for the services that they're providing that might bridge the gap. But I think as a practical matter, you have to, although the investors may, the first round investor may want to see a certain valuation, the reality that the market is what it is, and you have to. Often early round investors may, they may not be pleased, always with the way the company goes or how the valuations go. Sometimes valuations will go down, and that's not a good day. But that's the reality of what the marketplace is and where the company is going. So, do you guys have anything to add?
That's what it is.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about VCs. VCs very different from angels. Angels are investing generally their own money. VCs are investing other people's money, and that changes the game dramatically. So venture capital fund, it's a pooled investment vehicle. It's raising money from various types of investors who are called limited partners. It's often pension funds, family offices, high net worth individuals. The fund is professionally managed. So unlike an angel, angel is a guy out there investing his own money. A fund it's a professionally managed organization by someone who is compensated. Ordinarily, the standard has been 2 plus 20, a 2% management fee, plus 20% of the profits. A VC is investing in numerous portfolio companies, and funds, as I mentioned, generally have a life cycle, usually 10 years. So from the time that the fund is raised, from that point 10 years forward, the fund has to deploy the money they've raised. Their portfolio companies have to grow, they have to get to an exit, and then they have to be able to liquidate and return their money to investors. So that imposes a very strict timeline in terms of how they see the investment cycle, and that will impact you and your company. Lastly, funds often have a particular focus, whether it's the industry, investment size, the financing stage they look at. So it's important to know the funds that you're approaching, what they look at, what spaces they look at, what stage they go into.
Yeah, I would just say with regard to the VCs, I mean, and I realize in some instances you just don't have a choice. There's a limited amount of funding out there, and if you're lucky enough to get a VC interested in your company, and they're the only ones you go with it, and you live with them, whether they're going to be positive and help you in terms of managing and growing the company, or they're just going to be sort of an impediment. But the thing is, VCs definitely have a different perspective than founders in terms of what they want to do with the business, and generally most of them want to exit relatively quickly and get a good return on their money. So it is important to really have a sense, whether it's through meetings with the VCs or talking to other portfolio companies that have had experience with them, to kind of understand their philosophy and what they're going to be like when you're managing your company, because they will be with you closely, and generally they're going to have significant rights in terms of maybe the ability to veto certain decisions, or at least needing their approval to do certain things with respect to the company. So, it is important to really understand who you're getting in bed with here, because they really are going to be with you until you exit that company, and it can make a huge difference. I've had clients that have had very cooperative VCs who've really helped them grow and develop their management team and get significant industry contacts and help them position the company for a good exit that was good for everyone. And I've had others where founders just wanted to pull a decent salary out of it and sort of use it as a way to generate income, and that was completely at odds with what the VCs wanted to do, and it was a nightmare experience. So it's very helpful to the extent you can understand the objectives of your VC, their point of view, and just at least go into it eyes wide open. If there's no other financing alternatives, you understand what their expectations are.
And of course, sort of the most obvious thing is get some references, and the best references are to talk to some of the portfolio companies and see what their experience is.
Yeah, it surprises me how often companies don't do that. While the VC is diligencing you, you should be diligencing the VC and make sure you talk to people and find out how they have dealt with other companies. It's very important.
The question about how VCs, I mean, sorry, there are many out there that have a specific focus, like Google or GE. How often do they actually gonna really do also their financing sometimes with what is aligned to their business? For example, I'm in smart lighting, so GE and Google are really interested in that, and they both have reached out to us. It would be, of course, a very strategic, alliance, because at the end, having hack except into Google would be, everybody dreams of that. How realistic is it that if these VC firms actually reach out to you, that they're actually having also the mind of the other company in mind, or these alliances?
I'm not sure I understood the question. So
a lot of VC funds, the big ones, Google.
Well, when I think of Google, I mean, you mean like a venture arm of Google, or
the
I mean,
venture arm from Google,
right.
or the venture arm for GE. If they reach out to you, and obviously Google or GE have very vested interest in smart lighting technology.
Right.
Is there actually then, if they are reaching out to the venture arm, is there like a relationship that they actually also trying to advance the initial core business?
I would think so. I mean, I would think that's like I was saying with the fintech companies, we find like venture arms of banks and financial institutions when they're looking to make investments in fintech companies. It's not because they think there's going to be. It's not only because they think there's going to be a good return on the fintech company. They think there's some technology there that's going to be useful to their business. And a lot of times you'll see financial investment and then some kind of strategic commercial relationship, whether it's a license deal or something else between the business.
Yeah, but it really depends. I mean, that's true in fintech in particular and marketing services as well. But Intel, for example, has a venture arm, and they invest in companies that they think meet certain strategic goals of theirs, such as increasing the use of silicon. But they don't necessarily have another relationship with that company. They act like a VC. So it just really depends.
What happens to the finances of the company when VC exits?
Well, usually the VC is exiting when the company is exiting. So generally what happens is the company gets sold and everyone gets their money. But I'm not sure, are you talking about something else?
Well, if the company was doing very well and nobody above, Google didn't come to buy them, they were just doing their own thing. What would happen when the venture capitalist said, okay, we want you to buy our stock or something like that?
That can go a number of ways. I mean, there's a growing secondary market, and so sometimes one fund will take out position of another fund. Sometimes if the company's going well, it may be able to liquidate the investor's position.
Yeah, I think I would generally say that I don't usually see one venture company taking out another venture company in these types of deals. I would say normally what's going to happen is the company would get sold and the VCs would get whatever the economics are. I mean, generally the VC is going to have some kind of preferential treatment in a liquidation, so they'll have some kind of liquidation preference. So they'll get their money back plus some kind of return on their money, whatever terms you've negotiated, whether it's a 1x or 2x liquidation preference. So generally, they're going to get paid first because they're the VCs and they probably have some kind of preferred equity, and then the balance of the money will be distributed to the common holders.
Yeah, I think Kevin's right. It's going to be a hot opportunity where you're going to have one VC taking out another. Generally, what's going to happen is that the company's going to have to be sold, which is why we talk about, the company goes public. We talk about that less because it's it's a little bit more of a moonshot, when you're looking at the first stages of the company. But those are generally your alternatives. Okay, so benefits of VC financing. It can be a fast way to ramp up your operations. It allows you to focus on building your company as opposed to fundraising. That is, once you actually have the funds in the door, because it does take some time. Larger amounts than angel money, usually. And beyond money, if you get a VC that has a lot of, that's well known in the industry, that brings a lot of credibility to your company. So the VCs can add significant value, strategic industry and business advice. As we said, they're going to have a seat on the board, and they will likely make their views well known. They're going to keep you disciplined on moving the business forward, like it or not. Now, that can be good news or bad news, depending on who you are and how you feel about that. But one way or another, they're going to keep you moving towards an exit. They can provide a lot of contacts, which can be valuable. They can provide additional funding. And when it comes to an exit, they can be especially beneficial. Disadvantages. It can be expensive money. There can be significant dilution. That is to say, you'll give away a lot of your equity and own a much smaller piece of the company at the end of the day. Many VCs will not invest in small rounds. Not all. There are certain VC funds that have their investment objective to invest in small rounds. But generally speaking, VCs are less often a source of smaller amounts of money. As we noted, the fund structure demands a certain timeline to an exit. There will be shared control. They will have board seats. They will have veto rights. And ultimately, if things don't go well, you can find yourself out. They can get you replaced as a CEO. Now again, that may or may not be, that may be a bad thing or a good thing. I mean, some founders know what they do well, which is starting early stage companies, and they realize when it's time to step out. But there are many examples where CEOs were forced out, didn't want to go. We talked about objectives beyond raising money. VC money is time consuming to find and to close, and the transaction costs for a VC round can be significant. So it can be valuable, but as Kevin notes, it's very important that you know what you're getting yourself into, that you know who the VC is, and that you're making a good decision.
Just one thing, just about what you're talking about, the expensiveness of the VC funding. I mean, and it could be expensive, it could not be, depending on what happens with your company, right? So, but the one key thing, and I think a lot of founders and entrepreneurs don't necessarily do this at every stage, is really to think about, especially when you're doing, whether you have a friends and family round, and maybe a Series A round, or seed round, or an A round, that you kind of understand where you stand in terms of, so you're a founder, so run a liquidation waterfall. If we were to sell the company tomorrow for $10 million, what does that look like? You're going to have all these preferences associated with all the stock that you sell, whether it's a liquidation preference to the Series A, some other kind of minor preference to the seed round. Take a look at what that looks like. Run an analysis in terms of, okay, this is worst case, middle case, best case scenario. And you'd be surprised when you add up in some of the more onerous VC financings, when you kind of look at the liquidation preferences they have and the accumulating dividends that they have. Sometimes you have to sell the company for an incredible multiple as a founder, even to just make some money. I've had many instances where, when the market is just sort of lukewarm, that companies have been sold, and after you get finished paying the A and the C rounds, there's nothing there for the founders. And all they're doing is really working for an employment agreement, maybe with the buyer. And it's not a great position to find yourself in, and at least you should be aware of, like some of the guys said to me, I should have been a plumber for all the work I did. If I would have made $30 an hour being a plumber, I would have done a lot better than busting my ass trying to build this company and sell it for $20 million only to realize, a very, very small amount. So really understand the economics associated with all the stock that you'll sell and what you might result in as a common stockholder founder if you were to sell the company for, like I said, low case, middle case, best case round.
Yeah, and indeed, that is far and away the most common result in a liquidity event, is that the founders get very little or nothing. Most common.
And we will be getting into structuring around liquidation preferences in a bit and talk about that more. So what are VCs looking for? There are various factors that they think about when evaluating a company. They want to know about the size of the market. They especially care about the management team. I think for many VCs, the management team may be the most important factor, because they know that a good team can find a path to success one way or another. They're going to look for a technology that ideally is protected or protectable, maybe something that's patented, although that's not required, but that's something that they would like to see. Something that's preferably disruptive. VCs would like to see barriers to entry so that they know that if they invest in your company, that your company will be able to capitalize on that opportunity without a lot of other Me Too companies coming in and doing the same thing. And they'd like to see that there's some sort of market acceptance of whatever it is that you're doing. Remember that as interested as you are in the technology and what you're trying to build, what the VC cares about is how much money you're going to make for them. For them, you are an investment opportunity. And you have to keep that in mind all the way down the line. And this comes up particularly when you're pitching VCs. Founders, you guys know your technology cold. That's why you're doing this often. And so you need to explain the technology to the VCs. They need to know what you're doing, but don't get over-focused on that. Make sure you focus on how you're going to make them money, because that's ultimately what they care about. That's what they want to hear, and that's what they may care less about whether your product is the best solution. What they're going to care about is it a good enough solution with a team that has the ability and the strategy to get to a big exit. So how do you find these elusive VCs? I talked about the fact that they often have a focus, whether it's industry or stage. There are a lot of resources out there. So much on the web, online listings. Look at their websites. I mean, just read their websites. You can learn a whole lot about what they're looking for and what their objectives are just by reading what they put on the web. Talk to your attorney, to your accountant. They can be good sources of help you to identify VCs. VC fairs can be a good way to find out about VCs as well. You may have to pay something to get into them, but the VCs are usually there. Networking events and other entrepreneurs can be a source of identifying the appropriate VCs. So if you're in a particular space and you have a community of entrepreneurs that you work with, they can help you to figure out who the VCs are that are interested in that industry or that segment. How do you make the connection? Well, in a sense, I went over that to some extent. Ideally, it is a personal contact. That is the best way to connect with a VC. Whether it's an attorney, an accountant, a friend of yours, an entrepreneur who's in a company that VC has invested in. Any type of personal contact is going to be a whole lot better than simply an unsolicited email. VCs get hundreds, thousands of pitch decks from people like you, and they'll to some extent they go through them, but VCs to some extent are going to look for people in their network, people they trust, to help to funnel good opportunities to them. So to the extent that you can get to a VC through someone who's in their network, who they trust, that's a far better way to get their attention than the alternatives.
And like Paul was saying, I find that many of the companies that we work with that get funded, they're getting funded a lot through relationships that they have with other CEOs and other founders of other companies who've been funded by VCs. So I think, like you were saying, reaching out to similarly situated companies who've obtained early stage financing from other VCs is probably a really great resource.
Yeah, I mean, many of you are in incubators or shared workspaces. I mean, that's the conversation that happens around the water cooler. Can be really valuable in that regard. All right, how much are you raising? Well, rule number one, first and foremost, whatever you do, don't run out of cash. That's a bad day. But beyond that, how much should you raise and when do you raise it? I think the only point to be made here is I see this all the time with my clients. I'm sure you guys do as well. No matter how long you think it's going to take, and no matter either to raise the money or to build the company, it's likely to take longer than you think. And so many instances I've seen companies said, oh, we started 6 months early, we have plenty of time. 9 months later, they're scrambling. So start early, leave yourself plenty of time, think about how much you need, and then raise a good bit more than that, so you're going to. Kevin talked about funding the milestones. We'll talk a little bit about that. Or actually, this is what we're talking about. There it is. Such good timing. I guess I should read my own slides. So, staged financing. Kevin already spoke about this a little bit. You want to raise money to the next stage. What is the next thing that's going to come along in your company that's going to increase your valuation? So you start proof of concept, and then development, and then you go to market. Revenues, break even, profitability. There are all these steps along the way. At each one of those steps, you are increasing the likelihood of the ultimate success of your company. These are each milestones. So to some extent, you want to figure out what the next milestone is that's going to increase your valuation, and then make sure you're raising enough money now to comfortably get yourself to that next milestone, keeping in mind that things are not going to go as smoothly as you think.
Yeah, and then sometimes, you can, that's one aspect of milestones. What we see a lot, I'm sure you guys see it as well, and I used to see a lot more when financing was a little tighter. I think things are loosening up a little bit, and the money is a little bit more free-flowing since the economy's doing better, and there's a lot more, I think, financing activity. But the VCs, when times are not great, they'll fund more, I don't know necessarily VCs, angels, they'll fund on a staged basis. So they will commit to give you a certain amount of money, but they'll maybe give you $1 million up front. So maybe they'll commit for an overall amount of $3 million, but that $3 million might be broken up into 3 tranches of $1 million a piece, and they will only give you the second tranche when you reach a certain milestone. I mean, those are tough deals to do because sometimes it's hard to get there, and you want to have the security of having the funding. But in tighter times, you do see VCs imposing that kind of a structure where they'll do like a staged or a milestone financing because they want to see you hit proven benchmarks before they're going to commit any more money to you.
And failing to meet those benchmarks will just make it harder to find money elsewhere. So you're really locking yourself into that. It's almost like a built-in failure structure, and I really don't like that at all. I tell my clients to avoid.
Yes, as the slide says, just say no.
But look, we understand that sometimes you have to take the money. You just can't, there's no way around it. I mean, if you're lucky enough to get somebody to fund you, and it's on that basis, if it's going to get you to where you think you need to be, sometimes it is the only alternative. So it's easy as lawyers to say, oh no, we wouldn't do that, or we would advise against it. But the reality is, it beats kind of funding the company on your credit card or borrowing all the money from friends and family. So sometimes you just don't have an alternative, but you do what you got to do to get your company off the ground.
Do those types of things happen more with angel investors, or does it happen with VCs where they have like the?
I see them more with non-professional, non-VCs. I don't know if VCs will do that. They don't want to make the commitment of funds based on events, and they also, I think, recognize that that's very dangerous for the company. So I think they developed a methodology that they use to fund companies, which is you put a bunch of money in, you take it to the next level, and if it's there, you put another bunch of money in. But those kind of stage things are, in my mind, they're just so dangerous.
Yeah, and I've seen them like pretty small finances.
It's often, I see it with angels and often less sophisticated angels. And the thing is, if you do it, you'd like to make sure there's some type of valuation bump so that you get some benefit out of it. Because it's obviously it's not for the company's benefit, it's for the investor's benefit. It doesn't do you any good that your money is linked to certain milestones. But you want to at least, if they're going to cram it down your throat and you have to take it, at least make sure that you get some benefit from it in terms of it's reflected in the overall valuation or whatever it is. So, and I think the other, and what I tell my clients who find themselves in that situation is whatever you do, negotiate reasonable milestones. Really, if you have to agree to a milestone, like that it's linked to milestones, then where you push is that the targets have to be reasonable, and don't push on those, because it's one thing to have trouble, making having trouble with money to make your next milestone when you're looking for a new investor. But as Jerry says, when you're locked into an investor and you have to hit a milestone to get more money, and you don't meet that milestone, you're really in a bind at that point.
And I do understand the pressure when that's the only option that's open to you, but I've done a bunch of those things over the years, and I've not seen one of them work out well.
Okay, I wouldn't go that far. I represent investors who like to invest that way, and when they've been reasonable with milestones, and I've seen them work out. So, but being reasonable is what's important. But as you can tell, in case there's any question, we don't like them, and if you can avoid them, in our capacity as company counsel, we advise you to avoid them if you can. All right, so here we are at valuation. An art, not a science for early stage companies. For more mature companies, there are all sorts of more sophisticated ways to evaluate the value of a company. But for early stage companies, it's really, those techniques tend to go out the window. We talk about pre-money value, and that's the important concept here. What is the company worth? What does the investment community think the company is worth prior to the financing? So if the pre-money value is $3 million, and you have an investor who's coming in with $1 million, that means the post-money value is $4 million, and you own 100%, and at the end of the financing, you own 75%. And the investor who put in $1 million now owns 25%. So the pre-money value of $3 million is what we're focusing on. So what are the factors that are important in negotiating valuation? We talked about the things that an investor looks for, and it's really the same factors. What is the market opportunity like? How fast is it growing? What does the competition look like? The management. For a company with serial entrepreneurs that have had successful exits in the past, that company is inevitably going to get a better valuation than the same company with unproven management, because the strength of the management team is so important to investors. The product, do the investors feel comfortable that it's achievable, that you can scale it? Can you protect it? Is there a need for it? And how far along are you? Are you at proof of concept? Have you gone to market? Where are you at? So these are all the sorts of questions that a VC is going to be asking, in their own mind when they're evaluating a company. And the better the answers they get to those questions, that'll mean that they see the risk of that company being successful is reduced. That results in a higher valuation. But what I'd also say, on the other hand, we talked about founders being incentivized. So smart investors are also going to be thinking about making sure that there's enough equity left on the table that the founders have incentive to get to an exit. So, that goes either way, or that goes both ways. I think Jerry and Kevin are right that, founders often find themselves with not as much at the end of the day as they'd like or as they expected, but investors still do tend to be mindful of that, because if the founders are not incentivized, then the company's going nowhere. At the end of the day, what matters most in terms of getting a good valuation is whether there's some competition, whether you have multiple investors who are looking at your company.
Yeah, and I agree with Paul. I think more often than not, you will see investors, VCs, not really seek to impose an unreasonably high or low valuation on the company, in order to increase their share. Because I think they do understand that at some point, if you do cram down the founders and the people who have got option grants, and you make their option grants worthless, because you're taking your stock at such a low valuation that, you know, there's no incentive for these folks to work for you anymore. And really, most of these companies, the value really is in the people and the talent that are there. So you'd be surprised how many times they're kind of, while they're aggressive, they're still aligned with the idea that you know, they do want the entrepreneurs and the founders to make some money in it, because they realize that, you know, they don't really have a company there if people lose that incentive.
All right, so at this point we've figured out that you are in fact taking money. You've identified the VC or an angel. You know, we talked about valuation. So now we're going to talk about the structure of the investment, the types of securities. Three types of securities that we're focusing on here. Common stock, generally not something that sophisticated investors will invest into. That's the stock that founders receive. It's also used for equity plans. Excuse me. Convertible notes, that's a debt instrument that converts into equity in the next round of financing. We're also going to wrap up the concept of safes in there. We'll get to that in a minute. And then convertible preferred stock, which is equity that has some features of debt, has a liquidation preference. We'll talk more about that. The assumption here, we're really talking about C corporations. These types of structures can certainly be used and mimicked in the LLC, but most of the time tech companies are structured as C corporations. Certainly if you're doing a VC round, if you didn't start as a C corporation, you will convert into a C corporation. So that's how we will, you know, sort of carry the conversation forward.
Jargon alert. Can you just give us a sentence for what a C Corp and an LLC is?
Yes. First, I would recommend that you look at this slide. You go back to the program on session 1 where we talked about that. A C corporation is a traditional, it's the type of corporation that we've used for hundreds of years. It's a corporation, it's a separate entity, it has 2 levels of taxation. Unlike an LLC, which is it's basically a partnership, it's in the nature of a partnership. It has flow-through taxation, one level of taxation. Tech companies generally use C corporations because VCs want to invest in C corporations, largely because of the tax structure. LLCs can have some advantages. A lot of tech companies will start as LLCs because there are tax advantages to LLCs that they want to take advantage of. But by the time you get to this stage of the company's life, if you're taking venture capital money, you are going to be a C corp. You're going to convert to a C corporation. If you're taking angel money, you may be able to stay as an LLC because angels are often willing to invest into LLCs, unlike venture capitalists.
Well, I had a deal a couple of years ago, and we did a very large angel round, a $4 million angel round into an LLC, and halfway through the raise, the founder got a phone call from some people in San Francisco and went out there to meet with the large VCs that we don't like to talk about here in New York. And they wanted to invest, and they wanted to invest in that round, but they would only do it if the company was converted to a C Corp. So, I've never done this before, but literally in the middle of this offering, $2 million into the raise, we closed it. We converted the entity to a corporation, which took some doing, and then went back and sold the rest of the equity to those large VCs, and in January they put another $110 million into the company.
That's a nice story.
Yeah. That was the fastest conversion I've ever seen.
It hasn't had a happy ending yet, but
No.
Pretty happy.
it's moving in that direction. Yeah, I mean, I would suggest anyone who wants more information on that, take a look at the first session on choice of entity. Bottom line, if you're taking VC money, you will need to be a corporation, as Jerry has explained, even if you're mid-financing, mid-closing. Okay, we are running a little short on time, so we're going to try to move a little faster. So let's talk about some fundamental concepts, equity and debt. Equity, that's simply stock in the company, shares of stock. Equity is an ownership interest in the company. If you have equity, you have a right to a share in the profits. You also have management rights, you have voting rights, basically. When the company is sold, if you have equity, you're going to receive payment following the payment of any debt, loans, and following any preference that gets paid to preferred stock. It's an important concept. And I think Kevin and Jerry both talked about that. You want to make sure that as a founder, the common stock that you have is worth something at the end of the day, after the debt is paid off and after the preference is paid off to the VCs. Debt, on the other hand, is simply a loan. And like any loan, at some point it needs to be paid off. The principal gets paid plus any interest that's accrued. Sometimes it will be secured by the company assets. That's to say, if the loan doesn't get paid, the lender will be able to foreclose on the assets of the company. Upon liquidation, debt holders will get paid the amount of their principal plus interest, and that's it. They have no right beyond that to share in the profits of the company, and they have no voting rights. Now, what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the session is some variations on these. We're going to be talking about convertible notes. Convertible note is debt that is convertible into equity upon certain circumstances. And convertible preferred stock is equity that has certain features of debt, in that it has a right to receive payment prior to common stock.
So one thing, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, but one thing that's kind of, I know a lot of people said about like valuation is like it's very difficult to determine what the value of our company is, and it is. It's really like, it's really a shot in the dark, especially if you kind of pre-revenue or pre-market on your company. And one nice feature of the convertible note or the safe instrument is that it kind of allows you to put off that decision, because essentially what you're doing is you're saying, okay, this 100,000, and usually it's more, friends and family or very early stage round. The investors who put the money in, they essentially they're lending you the money. So in effect, it's a promissory note. You promise to pay it back. But if you were to conclude a financing of a certain size, usually there's a threshold, whatever it might be, $500,000 or $1 million, then the principal and interest that's accrued under that debt instrument converts into that round of equity. So in a sense, and usually it's at a discount, so they don't convert dollar for dollar. They get a little bit more for their dollar because they were in earlier and they took greater risk, or they get warrants to compensate them. It's really the same thing. But what it does is it sort of says, hey, we can't determine what the value of your company is now, so we'll lend you this money, and convertible notes never get paid back. They always convert when they're just worthless. So it allows you to put off that decision about what the value is until maybe a more institutional investor comes in and validates value. So it gives the investor a little bit greater cover, because they don't have to kind of be able to determine that with you now. They can allow that next qualifying financing to figure out what the value of your company is. So you see that a lot in very early stage financings.
Is that an unsecured?
Usually, it's unsecured for the most part. I mean, I've seen that's like sometimes you'll see that like unsophisticated. They'll ask for security, and then you got to get into this whole rigmarole about convertible notes are generally unsecured, and you don't really want to be granting up security interest on convertible notes. I don't know if you've seen it.
Pretty much never.
I've seen people ask for it, but it's usually people who are unsophisticated.
It's still a debt instrument, right?
It is.
And if you default, they can foreclose.
Yeah, but I mean,
in theory.
Yes, in
Well,
theory, yes.
We're gonna get to convertible notes in a minute, so we'll.
Yeah. It is a debt instrument.
Okay, common stock. We're not gonna spend long here. This is, as I said, it's an instrument that's held by founders. It's used for options. Is rarely used for investment. Certainly not by sophisticated. I won't say never, but rarely. Certainly not used by VCs. Convertible notes for an angel round, that is likely what you'll be using. Kevin's already talked about it a little bit. It is a debt that will convert to equity generally upon the next round of financing. So you will make so the investor will make a loan, and then when the next round of financing comes along, which is usually preferred stock, that loan will convert into whatever instrument is being sold in that financing. So generally the way it works is you'll have an angel investor, they'll invest several $100,000. The company advances further, a VC comes along, they want to do a Series A, and then whatever your investor has invested through the convertible note will convert into the Series A stock. As Kevin noted, it will usually be at a discount, often 80% is pretty common, so that early stage investor will get more for their money than the VC to compensate them for the risk that they took in coming in early. Okay? Now, as Kevin notes, it avoids negotiations over valuation, which saves everyone time. However, in recent years, notes usually have a valuation cap. I'll explain quickly what that means. Let's say an investor wants to invest $100,000 in your company, and they're thinking, maybe this company will do the next round at, say, $2 million or so. And so my $100,000 would be worth 5% of the company if I did the math right. Now, so they're thinking, okay, that's going to compensate me for my risk, more or less. But let's say the company doesn't do a raise at $2 million. They grow and they do better and they bring in revenues and they postpone it. And when they finally do a financing, the value is $10 million. So this $100,000, instead of being worth 5% of the company, is worth 1% of the company. Again, if I did my math right. But you understand the point. So the early stage investor is saying, wow, I put my money in at a point when there was so much risk, and I'm really not getting much of a reward for that. So the innovation that over recent years is to put in caps to say, well, Mr. Early Stage Investor, whatever the ultimate value is when the next round is done, you will not convert at a value higher than X, say $5 million. And so that early stage investor knows they have some protection that whatever their deal ends up being, it won't be worse than whatever their percentage would be based on that cap. Now, that protects the downside, the risk for the investors, but now what was a very easy instrument, as Kevin says, with no valuation, now you're negotiating what's the cap going to be. It's not quite the same as having to negotiate the cap in a preferred round, but it adds a layer of complication. Other things to think about with convertible notes, they are prone to renegotiation, as I think we spoke about. You always have the risk that the next round investors will try to trim back the rights that the angel investors got with their early notes. But convertible notes are definitely faster and less expensive than preferred, more complex than common, but again, we don't use common that often. Convertible notes, you do have an interest rate. It's usually low and nominal. The investors are not investing for the interest. It can be secured, but it almost never is. And they're often issued in multiple series.
Since it is unsecured, what happens if there's a default?
Well, look, as a practical matter, if there's a default, if the note becomes mature and is supposed to be repaid, and there's no money to pay it, that puts the company into bankruptcy. As a practical matter, often what happens on these notes are structured so at maturity, they don't get repaid, but they get converted into common, or they could get converted into a previous round of preferred stock.
I mean, what you typically see a lot of times, like companies don't have the money to pay it, usually they're relatively short term, like a year or a short term period. It's supposed to just bridge the gap to your next financing. So a lot of times you'll see them extended. You see that's probably the most common. I mean, I don't know if Jerry's seen, like,
happens a lot.
you don't really see people trying to, bring a default judgment against somebody who's, it's like suing someone who got no money. So it's really throwing good money at the bat. You don't usually see people trying to enforce rights under a convertible note. Either the company's going to do well and you're going to convert it into the next round, or you're just going to kind of chalk it up as a loss.
well, I mean, I guess the point is, if the note can't be repaid and can't be restructured, then basically the company is usually as a loss at that point anyway. So, there ain't anything there to go after.
Paul, you might mention the safe at this point, because the whole purpose of the safe was to avoid this problem of having an obligation outstanding.
Yeah, well, yeah, why don't we'll get to the next, I mean, we'll talk about the safe in a moment, and that will,
Okay, I have a question about the common stock. Why is it actually disadvantageous in early angel funding to not issue just common stock to the angels? What I understand, preferred stock are actually more expensive to structure.
So if you can do that, if you have an angel investor who's willing to take common stock in exchange for that investment, I think that's great. I mean, a lot of times you see that they want to have certain kind of preferential rights associated with their investment. So, I mean, I think Paul was just saying, because for the most part, you see sometimes it looks like a seed round. It's not quite a full-blown preferred, but it's got some preferential rights associated with it. But I think if you have somebody willing to invest money in your company and they're willing to take common stock in exchange for that investment, that's not a bad thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing you have to be concerned about when you're selling common stock is that you're putting a value on the common stock, and you're going to need to address that when you have your option plan, because you're putting a value on it.
Can you explain that? That I don't fully understand.
can you want to explain that, Jerry?
Okay, well, option plans are designed to provide incentive to your employees. And the idea is that you grant them options on equity. It's usually almost always common equity at as low a price as possible. And the way you can do that is by never selling it, only selling preferred stock, and then claiming a discount on the common from the valuation that the preferred stock has because of the preferential rights that the preferred stock has. So you can, if you sell preferred stock for $1 a share, you may be able to take the position that the common stock is worth 20 cents a share or something like that. And that means you can issue those options to your employees at a much lower strike price, which is beneficial to them, it's attractive to them. So for companies that need to attract staff by using options, having a low price is an advantage.
So by the same token, me as the founder would also devalue my own stock.
No,
No,
because you get your stock at the outset. You can get your stock for a penny. And often that's, not much more than that is what you pay for it. So you're not putting any kind of value on the common stock either.
And it's not necessarily reflective of what the true value of the stock is if the company were to be sold. But the problem is if you're giving somebody an option and the exercise price on the option is less than the fair market value, there's going to be an immediate taxable event for them. So you can't price the strike price of your options below the current fair market value, or else you're going to cause an issue for your employee who's getting the option. So you try to discount down the price. So like Jerry was saying, you can give your employees options at the lowest price possible.
And if the price isn't that low, employees who are smart will recognize that, and that will make it difficult for you to attract good people. I mean, that's people want low-priced options. So if you're, to bring it full circle, if you're selling common to your investors, you're setting this high value, that becomes the price for your options, and that may cause problems with your employees, bringing on your employees. So that's your company problem. But Kevin's absolutely right. If you need to deal with that issue, but otherwise, if you can get investors to take common, generally as a founder, that's not a bad day for you, because there are not a lot of rights that get associated with common. As a founder, there are a lot of benefits.
No preference.
No preference. Yeah. Okay. We got to keep moving. We've already talked about. What's that?
No.
Oh, sorry. Do we have a question?
Yeah, I had a quick question, just about convertible promissory notes. How often do you see automatic conversion on maturity? Like half the time, or less than half, or?
On the maturity of the note?
I see it on occasion.
I'm sorry, Jerry. The
I
question
would say
is,
the vast majority of the ones we do.
Can we repeat the
just
question,
come
Jerry?
due, and there's no conversion.
just wanted to repeat the question.
Oh.
The question is, how often do we see automatic conversion upon maturity on convertible notes? And the answer is?
And what I was saying was that I have seen it from time to time. I would say the vast majority of the ones that I see and that I do do not have that feature. The note has a maturity date, and it comes due on maturity, and you deal with it.
Yeah, I'd say I don't see that very often. Are we okay with that? No, someone just had a question. I didn't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Just with regards to the previous question regarding common stock as an angel investment, so if we're in a negotiation right now with an angel investor who says that he will not do.
You have to speak up.
We're speaking with an angel investor who says he won't do a convertible note. What are the other options? Is it just common stock or is it convertible stock?
We will get there in a moment. That's the next section. Okay, so we've talked about the convertible notes. These are the terms. How much is it going to be for? The term of years or months. The interest rate, not usually a big issue. How interest gets handled. Is it converted to equity or is it paid? Conversion rights. There's usually a minimum financing size for a conversion. It could be 250,000, 500,000, whatever it is, some minimum round size for the next financing. That helps to protect the investor so they know that they will convert upon an actual raise of money. We've talked about the discount, we've talked about the cap. We can move on. Other aspects, what happens upon a liquidity event if the company is sold? It will convert to common, or there will be a premium payment. Rights upon maturity, we just talked about this as well. Basically it could be repaid, or it converts to common, or to an existing round of preferred. We talked about security. Usually it doesn't have. There is no security, and sometimes notes will have a feature that the majority of interested note holders can amend the terms of the notes. As a company, that's a good feature to have, because that means that if you do need to renegotiate the notes in connection with a future round of financing, if there's a reasonable deal put on the table, a majority of the note holders can force any holdouts to come along. Jerry, do you want to talk about the SAFE? You were okay. All right. So the SAFE is a relatively recent innovation, developed actually by Y Combinator out in California. Simple agreement for future equity. Basically, it's similar to a convertible note, but simplified and without some of the features that make a convertible note problematic. So no interest is paid. As I noted, interest is usually not a big issue anyway, and SAFE simply dispenses with interest altogether. There's no maturity date, so it stays out there as long as until something happens to it. So you don't have this issue about what happens when you reach maturity. Generally, there's no qualified financing threshold, so on any future financing it will convert, and upon an acquisition it converts into common or is repaid. So it's basically, it has some of the features of a convertible note, but it eliminates some of the problematic aspects of the convertible note. It can be with or without a cap, with or without a discount. It's standardized. I mean, Y Combinator has several versions on their website, and if you choose one of their standardized versions, it's very simple. It keeps the fees down and it reduces the time of negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, they're relatively new, but I haven't seen too many of them. I don't know, maybe done one or two. But I think you're going to see more of them, actually, because they really are easy to put in place, and you don't have to sort of negotiate all these debt provisions, these default provisions that are really essentially meaningless anyway, because you're not going to call a default on a convertible note. It's pretty much meaningless. So I think it really streamlines the process, and I think, given the fact that a lot of the incubators like Y Combinator are using it, there's sort of a market acceptance of it, and people are saying, well, instead of doing a convertible note, let's just use these SAFE instruments. They're really short. It's like 2 or 3 pages long. The legal fees to do it, it's like you can just pump them out really in like a half hour time. So I really think you're going to see the use of these SAFE instruments a lot more because of their ease of use. And it effectively does the same thing as a convertible note, and it sort of eliminates all the unnecessary aspects of it, I think.
Yeah, I agree. We haven't seen a lot of them yet, but I think we're going to be seeing more of them. And I think, for us in the community, it seems that in the legal community, it's a good innovation.
How is it standardized? Is it like?
I mean, it's standardized because there's a standard form that Y Combinator has,
So they kind of stand.
Yeah, so one of the large incubators created it, and they have 2 or 3 variations of the form. One has a cap on the valuation of the company, one has a discount, you know, blank the
So
discount.
people are just picking up Y Combinator
Yeah,
standards.
exactly, so.
yeah. I mean, Y Combinator has,
Everyone to use, basically.
Oh,
they
okay.
sort of open source them, and people are using them, and it's really to everyone's benefit. You know, I mean, it's fast, it's cheap, it eliminates difficulties, as Kevin noted, and so, you know, there's, I mean, I don't want to get too into it. From the investor side, you know, there are probably things you might prefer. There are aspects of some convertible notes you prefer to a safe, but generally speaking, you know, I haven't seen investors, you know, blink on them. So, all right. Okay. So we had a question: what do we use if we're not using a convertible note? And I will say at the outset, I mean, I think this is a good question. VCs definitely, and sophisticated angels will often want to go with a preferred instrument with preferred equity rather than a convertible note. You know, we talked about the ways in which a convertible note is subject to getting knocked back on rights. And you know, investors who know what's going on won't want to be in that position. If they're investing a meaningful amount of money, they'll want a preferred equity. So, how does convertible preferred work? It has the touchstone of convertible stock is a preference. It gets paid a preference upon a liquidation. So if you invest $1 million in preferred stock, you have a 1x liquidation preference. That means when the company is sold or liquidated, you know, for whatever reason, in whatever way, you will get paid your $1 million before the common stock gets paid anything. So you have that preference. So in that sense, it has that feature of debt, in which the preference gets paid back to the investors prior to any payment to common holders. It also can have a participation element to it, so that once you have paid you've gotten back your $1 million, you will continue to share in the proceeds as though you had converted to common. That's what we call participating preferred, or also known as double dip preferred, because you get paid your $1 million up front, and then you share in the proceeds going forward. Now, another type of preferred stock is non-participating preferred. You have to make your choice. You either you take your $1 million and you go away, or you convert to common and you share with common. But you don't get to have both. You don't get your $1 million up front and share in the proceeds.
But you make that decision when you know how much you would get, so you would presumably decide to convert if you would get more money than the preference.
Yeah.
So it's a logical thing.
It's not. You're not making a choice in a vacuum. You make a choice when the event is before you. But the important thing is, it doesn't give the investor the ability to get the preference and to participate. If the company is going badly and there's not going to be much left, you're probably going to take your preference. You're going to take your $1 million and go away. If it's a huge exit, obviously you're going to convert, because you're going to want the upside of common.
You can also have a preferred that does that automatically.
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing in general concepts. There are many variations. And I would also say the participation can be capped as well. So once you get to a certain level, you no longer participate. So it gives investors downside protection because they can get their preference. It can increase their returns through the participation provision. You have protective provisions in preferred stock. We talked about veto rights, control rights. This is basically the ability to exercise some control over when the company is sold, future financing, and this is important. So this is a big difference from convertible debt. Convertible debt doesn't get voting rights. Participating stock gets voting rights and veto rights. We talked about pricing options. If you are selling your investors preferred stock as opposed to common stock, it allows you to keep those attractive low-priced options for your employees. Strengthens your balance sheets compared to debt. designated by series A, B, C, and D. As we noted, unlike convertible notes, convertible preferred is much more likely to preserve your right, to preserve the investor's rights in a future round of financing. I mean, it's always, if there's a down round, everyone's at risk. But generally speaking, preferred holders are able to maintain their rights better than convertible note holders. It's
One thing you'll always find in a preferred series, of, at least an A and a B, is that you can impose a series with sort of superior rights, pari passu or superior rights on top of them without getting their approval. So you do sort of you have created a situation, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but you can't just, once you put a series of preferred stock in as a financing mechanism, you're going to need the approval of that series in order to do your next round.
all right. It is the downside of preferred stock is that it does take more time to negotiate, and it's more costly in terms of legal fees. But as we noted, sophisticated investors will often want it. It's standard in VC deals and in many sophisticated angel deals. So we talked about the principal terms. We'll go over them quickly. We probably have about 10 more minutes, and then we'll be wrapping. We talked about the liquidation preference. That is the touchstone of a preferred stock, the amount that the investor gets back before the common holders. What I didn't note is that it is often expressed, it can be a multiple. We don't see that much in the current market, I would say, or at least I'm not seeing much of it, but sometimes you'll see multiples. So the investor will get back not just 1 times their investment, but 2 times their investment. Again, relatively rare these days. We talked about options. These are the terms that get negotiated in a preferred stock deal. The option pool, is it put in place before or after the investment? Generally, the option pool is going to be priced into the round beforehand. That is to say, the dilution will be taken by the common holders, and then the investors will price the round based upon an option pool of 10, 15, 20%. Is there anything to? Redemption rights. This is rarely exercised, but something to understand. This is the right of the preferred investors to force the company to buy back their stock at some point in the future. Often it will be on year 5 and a payment over 3 years. Sometimes there will be a premium built in. As a practical matter, this is a provision that is sometimes in the documents, but is basically virtually never exercised. It exists simply as a way, we talked about the timing needs of a VC fund. This is a way for the investors to force the founders to do something that they might not otherwise want to do.
No, I was going to say, you see it, VCs, I think they love it. I don't know why, they seem to really like it. Redemption, right? They think that they're going to be able to put their stock back to you, and usually they're not looking to exercise the redemption unless the company's not doing well, and that's probably the time that they can never put their stock back to you because you don't have money to pay it. So I think sometimes you see it as utilized as a sort of a leverage to force the founders to try to sell the company, use it as a threat to say, we're going to put the stock back to you, and if otherwise, really want you to get in the sale process, start, putting the company up for sale, or we will exercise our redemption rights. But I think it's one of those things that you see a lot. It's not really one of those hills that I would die on. I would fight much harder on your liquidation preference and your protective provisions and maybe your anti-dilution provisions. But this is one that you see a lot. It kind of looks like a scary right, but generally, like Paul was saying, I don't think you generally see it having much effect on the companies. Right. It's like registration rights. Just sign whatever they put really. Don't waste your time.
And it's pretty much standard. I mean, you often see 5 years with it, but as Kevin points out, if you cannot redeem, the investor takes board seats, and they take over. So basically they're saying, redeem us, which you can't do, or sell the company, but give us an exit, basically. Anti-dilution. If there's the next round of investment is at a lower round than the previous round, that's what we call a down round, which is an unhappy day for everybody. for founders, for investors, for everybody. Investors want protection from a down round, and they get that through anti-dilution protection, which means basically it resets the conversion price so that if they, at some point when they convert into common, they're going to get an increased amount of common than they would otherwise have gotten. That comes out of your hide as the founder. So anti-dilution protection is something for investors' benefit, for your detriment, but it's something you pretty much need to live with. We talked about protected provisions, the veto rights. It's usually on significant company actions, mergers, sale, future financings, debt financings, amendments, certain amendments to the charter documents. These are provisions which are often heavily negotiated, and for good reason, because if they are overbearing, they are going to they could limit you at important points in the company's growth. So there's something to be aware of. Board composition is also another important factor. A VC investor will certainly want representation on the board. The question is how much. Is it 5 seats and they have 2? Maybe sometimes there'll be 2 preferred and 2 common and 1 independent investor. There are any number of ways that boards will get structured, but it's very important because it really is going to go to the amount of control that you have over the company. Another thing to think about is there a minimum ownership interest below which the investors lose their seats?
And a lot of times what you see is, in addition to a board seat, they'll require that they have to be at least 1 independent director. So a lot of times, they'll have their seat, but then they'll have an independent that will kind of be subject to the mutual approval of maybe the common and the preferred, because they want somebody who's sort of more of a professional board member. Because a lot of times they get into these companies, they'll have a seat on the board, they won't necessarily have any control position with the seat, so they like to have sometimes an independent who's going to be sort of like a voice of reason on the board. You do see that a lot.
Okay, other provisions we're not really going to talk about in terms of convertible preferred because they're perhaps less important. Dividends, sometimes there's usually dividend provision, but no one's in this for the dividends, and they don't really usually amount to much. Conversion rights is simply the automatic conversion upon an IPO. Information rights, financial statements, when did they get them? Are they audited? Registration rights is the rights to have the stock registered upon an IPO. As Jerry says, generally, whatever is put in front of you is pretty standard, and you just sign it. It's not worth the time to negotiate it. Rights of first refusal. If someone is selling their stock, do other holders have rights to buy that stock? Transfer restrictions are restrictions that various equity holders may have upon the transfer of their equity. Drag along and tag along rights. If a majority of the stockholders want to sell their equity, can they force the others to go along? And tag along rights is the flip. If someone wants to sell, can the other holders do they have a right to go along with them? No shop is something at the term sheet stage. If you sign a term sheet as a founder, that will usually say that you do not have a right to negotiate with other VCs for at least a limited period of time. Legal fees, who pays them?
You do.
One way or another, you do. Last topic, we're going to talk very quickly about securities laws. Just a few takeaways here. The securities laws are relatively easy to comply with as long as you focus on them and do it timely. As we note, there are 3 ways that securities get sold. They're either registered, there is an exemption that you have identified, and in all other instances, it's illegal. Don't be there. Don't issue your securities illegally. So basically what it amounts to is that whenever you're selling securities, selling stock, you have to identify an exemption and make sure you comply with that exemption. This is something for a securities lawyer for sure. For current purposes, a security is everything we've been talking about today. Convertible stock, common stock, convertible debt, safe, these are all securities, whether it's a corporation or an LLC. What's covered by the securities laws? Basically, any time you're issuing, selling, or promising equity, whether it's to founders, to investors, to employees, to board members, to customers, finders, brokers, anyone. Your brother, your uncle. This is something my clients, I often have with my clients. They think, well, it was just a little bit of equity, and it was kind of informal, and so it doesn't really count. It counts. It doesn't mean it's going to be difficult to figure out the exemption, but don't think that it doesn't count. There's a very common exemption called Rule 506 under Reg D, which is what we very often use, that allows you to sell an unlimited investment amounts of any size to an unlimited number of accredited investors, which is basically an investor. It doesn't even mean a high net worth individual. I'd say rather it's someone who is not a low net worth person. It's a $200,000 income each year, or $300,000 with a spouse, or a net worth of $1 million, not including your primary residence. So it's not such a high threshold. There's no specific written disclosure. There are general solicitation and advertising prohibitions. There are limited filings required. It's generally a very easy exemption to comply with, but it's important that you comply with it. A few points finally that I'll say. An issue that I think we all see is finders. Our clients will come to us and say, well, so-and-so says they can raise $1 million for me and they want 5% of the raise. Sounds like a good deal. Well, if that person is not a registered broker-dealer, if they are an unregistered finder, then they are acting in violation of the securities laws, which will get them and you into trouble. So if you're working with someone who's taking a commission for raising you money, you need to make sure that they are a registered broker-dealer. The consequences of non-compliance with the securities laws, if you get caught, they can be severe. SEC or state enforcement actions, and take the state seriously. It's not just the SEC you need to be concerned about. The states can be very aggressive in their enforcement. Civil and criminal penalties, criminal meaning jail time, rescission rights, having to basically have to buy the stock back, undo the transaction. It can become a disclosure issue going forward, that you have to disclose that there was a violation of the securities laws, and it could potentially derail an IPO or an acquisition. I would not overstate that, but it can certainly slow things down. I think the bottom line here on the securities laws is they do apply even to early stage companies, to small amounts of equity and small amounts of money. They're relatively easy complied with, but make sure you do it, because if you get it wrong, it can be a mess to clean up after the fact. Last thing, yes,
No, I agree. I mean, look, we understand the realities. It's difficult. Companies don't have a lot of money to spend on legal fees for lawyers to kind of do a review of the securities laws. But I mean, it is something, at least if you're gonna not technically comply with all the things, at least know what you're doing. I mean, take calculated risks. I'm not saying that not comply with the securities laws, but I think a lot of people just don't understand that when they're, as Paul was saying, if it's a debt instrument, it's a note, it's a safe instrument, it's a convertible preferred stock. These are all securities, and they're all regulated by the securities laws. So just be mindful of it, and you'd be pretty well served to consult with somebody about it and knows what they're doing before you sell it.
So that brings us to the end of our presentation. A couple of comments. If you think that this presentation was long, I cut out about 10 slides that were in the last version of this presentation that Jerry and I presented a couple of years ago. I have put some of those at the end of the presentation in the distribution version. So there's some bonus material that you may want to take a look at. Leave us your business card if you'd like to get a copy of the presentation. Beyond that, we can take a few more questions. If anyone has questions. The gentleman in the back?
Yeah, how common is it to get founders preferred stock?
Not at all.
Who are you being preferred over?
Yeah. Not at all. I've never seen it.
mean, sometimes founders will buy preferred stock in follow-on finance.
Yeah, yeah.
That happens, but the stock that gets issued
Okay.
to founders at the outset of the corporation is always.
Well, I would say, I'm not sure exactly what the nature of your question. There are some different types of instruments out there now that people are experimenting with. And so founders, there is an instrument out there where founders they'll get some of their equity in common and some equity in sort of a type of preferred instrument that can allow them at some point that they can sell to get some liquidity in the company. So, I mean, there are some innovations out there, but generally speaking, if you're just talking about preferred stock, like the investors get, the answer is no. The founders get common.
Yeah, and like I said, the investors are going to layer on top of you. So if you have preferred, they're going to prefer over you. So you know what I mean? It's not going to be worth all that money. Yeah. So it's really not going to matter, I don't think, too much.
There's another question?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about voting rights and in terms of common stock? Is it always a separate agreement? Who's gonna, if you issue common stock, who's gonna get the voting rights?
I mean, generally, unless you have a shareholders agreement that specifically deals with issues about voting, the common stock is going to just be whoever controls the majority of the stock is going to control the decisions related to the common. So there's no real, you know, it's basically a majority rule situation. With really, you know, unless you have a particular preferred stock that has specific voting rights, generally, if you just have common with no shareholders agreement, it's going to be majority controls.
With a shareholder agreement, you would assign the voting rights to.
Well, the shareholder agreement might say, I mean, you don't see, I mean, it might say that you would vote a particular way to constitute the board in a certain way, like, you know, a 5-member board with 2 people, you know, a president is on one and independents on another. That's generally what a shareholders agreement might do with an early stage company, kind of deal with voting rights as they relate to the board.
Does the uncapped convertible note means free money, or it does create any future concern or issues for future VC?
I didn't hear the first one.
I didn't hear the question.
It's a uncapped convertible note.
Uncapped.
Uncapped.
Uncapped convertible note, free money. Of course, it's uncapped. It's always not dealing with a future investment.
I mean, if what you're asking is, I think that if you have an uncapped convertible, the investors coming in on the subsequent round, they don't really care about the cap, right? So if it's uncapped, that person's just converting in at the price of the round that's being done, or sometimes there's a discount, like Paul was saying, maybe they're doing it at 80% of the value. So that doesn't generally present any problem for the VCs coming in and doing the next round of financing if you have a convertible note. I mean, I generally don't see, I don't know if you guys have seen this as well, but like, I don't see a big fight about that discount. I think, you know, people, yeah, you know, like, so if that note converts at a 10% discount or 20% discount, I think the follow-on investors, they sort of understand these guys with their early money, and they took a bigger risk, and they're willing to let them have that discount. And usually the dollars aren't that much in relation to the round that's being done. The amount that is borrowed under the convertible notes is usually relatively low, so it doesn't have a huge economic effect.
The thing that I agree, the thing that I see more often is that the next round investors may not want the convertible note holders to have the same voting rights as they to vote with them. And so sometimes that gets to be an issue, how the voting rights play out with the preferred. But
they just want to make sure they have control. I
Yeah.
mean, they want the note holders to be subordinate. They don't want them to have any control. So whatever works to get them to that point, I find it.
Yeah, and usually on those, let's say we had created a Series A, you know, what generally it is when we're talking about, okay, the Series A holders have a right to veto certain transactions, or, you know, you can't do a merger without their approval. That really means that the Series A voting as a class, the majority of the Series A make that determination. So, like Jerry was saying, as long as the new investor knows that they're going to control the majority of that class, they'll probably be okay with it.
all right, that looks like it.